Good morning, Fremont County, and welcome to 101.7 KDNO's the WyoToday Newsroom for March 31st. I am Kevin Shields, your host, filling in for Sarah today as she's on deadline putting out the Ranger and Lander Journal. And today on WyoToday Newsroom, we're joined by the Leavitt Group, Gordon Sawyer and Rulon Gardner. And before you ask, folks, yes, that Rulon Gardner, Olympic bronze and gold medalist, the one famous for taking down the undefeated Russian whose name escapes me,
Alexander Karelin.
And what was one of the big upsets. It's all over YouTube. Go look it up. It's really cool. But of course, like we were just talking about, fellas, life kind of happens, and you get older, and you move on into careers and stuff. So it's a pleasure to have you guys here. The Leavitt Group, as we were talking about earlier, your dad started it back in 2004. Talk about your dad a little bit and what led him into the insurance game. I know he worked for someone who has a local branch here already, but how he got involved in insurance and how that led you into it.
My dad didn't start the Leavitt Group. Leavitt Group is one of the largest brokers in the nation. They're the largest family-owned brokerage in the nation. It got started down in Cedar City, Utah. But my dad was part owner in an agency down in Arizona, and he still did a lot of business in Wyoming because he sold insurance, oil and gas, and things like that. Brian Sawyer for years. So he was about 42 years in the industry before he retired, and then they brought me in because I was a friendly face and knew a lot of the clients to take over some of that business. So that's how I got roped into this game. And so we're here to help as many people as we can now.
All right, Rulon, how did you get involved in the insurance business?
Well, I started out with my aspirations to be a teacher and grew up in the Star Valley, Afton, and then ultimately went to college and got a wrestling scholarship to a junior college. I was a one-time state champion from the Star Valley and ended up going in and then going to the junior college route, won the nationals, and was offered a scholarship at Northwest and Powell, and ended up going to Rick's Junior College in Idaho, and then won the nationals there, went to Nebraska, and then had Olympic aspirations, got my teaching degree from Nebraska, and then wanted to go out and make the Olympic team, and ended up, making the Olympic team in 2000 and won the gold, and then came back in 2001, won the World Championships and won the bronze, and decided to retire in 2004, and then got exposed to the insurance industry, and I've been in it for 6 years now, and now working for the Leavitt Group, the Leavitt Group Insurance of the Rockies. So loving it, and now it's good to be back in Wyoming and helping people out.
Awesome, and folks, I'm about a foot from an actual Olympic gold medal, closest I've ever been to one, which is kind of really, really cool. So you mentioned that the Leavitt Group is the largest private insurance company.
They're the largest family-owned insurance brokerage
private
in the nation. Yeah.
And as a family-owned, along with that, which is a big-time difference than a lot of modern insurance companies, what else makes the Leavitt Group different? What's kind of sets y'all apart from any other group out there today? So
the Leavitt Group itself, when they come in and they partner with a local agency like they did with Aspen Agency in Casper, where we're out of, they come in and they still like to keep it local. Bill and Debbie that owned it before, they're still there. They basically still run things like a local agency. They just have national power and help behind it, which brings in a lot bigger carriers, a lot more options, commercially and personal insurance-wise, and just makes things so we can service. We just have so much more opportunity to service. We have bigger teams, trainings. It's a fantastic place to work and to help clients out.
This is Rulon here. What I think makes, I think the Leavitt Group a great place to work, and then ultimately great company to work with. I think we go in and we do a lot of customer service. We have, like, on our side, we do our commercial, and then we also have our PNC, our property and casualty, where we do home and auto. And being in the commercial aspect of it, I think we have risk management. We go in, we develop a relationship, and we're not here to sell on price. We're here to sell on service, and how we can make sure that you have the right coverage. And we're working with some of the businesses here in the Riverton area and Lander, and just like to create relationships. From my former life, we were just talking about the Ron Thon Wrestling Tournament here, locally. I'm actually working with Nike and doing a bunch of wrestling camps this summer, kind of all over the United States. We have one in Casper in June, and got to meet a bunch of the coaches and saw them in in Riverton, and then we got to see them at the state tournament this last month, and just be part of the community. And it's great to be back in Wyoming and try to make a difference. And we're working with some of the bigger companies here locally in Riverton already, and looking forward to creating more relationships.
And insurance is one of those things. It's an extremely complicated thing. Whether it's a business or an individual, they need experts like you guys and your team to help walk them through it, because certain stuff everybody's familiar with. You got to have liability insurance on your car, stuff like that. You've got to have health insurance. Ever since basically Obamacare made it a law where you had to have that. But as one of the owners here, it gets really complicated really fast. So having a great amount of experience in those lines helps. Talk a little bit about your base in Casper, your offices. Talk a little bit about the experience in that Casper office that helps everybody out.
Yeah, so in our Casper office, we've got agents. We've got the two previous owners, Bill and Debbie, are still there. Bill has probably got 40 years of experience in insurance. We have Lois in our office, who's a trucking specialist. She's got well over 40 years of experience. Like you said, Rulon, he's got, 6 or 7 years. I'm a little newer, but, my dad was in the industry for 42 years, so I kind of got trained up when I was even a kid about all this stuff, have had to learn pretty quickly on the fly with taking over a new book or the part of his book of business. And then our office our head office down in Vernal, Utah, with our agency, the amount of oil and gas knowledge and experience in trucking in that office is pretty unrivaled, and 40 plus service employees down there to take your call and get these certificates at a moment's notice, and so a lot of experience.
Yeah, I think building those relationships is the nice part about it. And the one thing about having Bart as our broker with 25 years experience, and his knowledge and his expertise has been really nice to be able to come back to Wyoming, where sometimes being in a smaller community or being kind of on the outside of what everybody, it's not Casper, it's Riverton, or it's Shoshone, wherever it's at, it's servicing those accounts. And the last week we've gone out, and a lot of times people see their agent, and insurance is one of those necessary evils where if you don't have it, you wish you did have it if you don't have it. And it's just one of those things, it's better to look at what could happen and not what has happened. You got to think about the future, and mitigating risks. That's one of the biggest parts of insurance. And so making that difference, I like it. And everybody said, why did you get into insurance? You could have done professional wrestling. I could have fought MMA, UFC, and I fought one time in Japan, and my mom's like, I didn't raise you to kill people, so I turned down $1 million for my second fight, and decided that I wanted to make a difference. And with all my near-death experiences, from frostbite to plane wreck to snowmobile accident, and numerous ones along the way, you just got to make better choices. And insurance has got me to look at things and taking risks that we never talked about. Grew up on a dairy farm in Afton, the youngest of 9, and I have so many scars and so many things that have happened to me through the years that, I look at life differently now being an agent. You want to think about, what could, potentially, happen. Driving here this morning from Casper, just made me think about passing a vehicle. What's the risk of that? If something happens, a deer comes out. We all have stories like that, and just preparing to, live a long and happy life. I think that's what, we try to do in America is, give people the right to go out and enjoy, the beautiful Wyoming, country here, but then also making good choices and being happy.
Well, and it's one of those things that, I know I do when I make the payments every month and things of that nature. It's one of those products that you hope you never need.
Yeah.
But it's a disaster if you need it and you don't have it. So it's a very important part of, having your back, but also, various things from protecting the company from liability to massive loss to as something as simple as if I pass on taking care of my kids, so to speak. You've mentioned oil and gas and you mentioned trucking. Are those your primary industries that you focus on?
Yeah, so that is our main focus mostly is, oil and gas covers, transportation, construction, a lot of fields like that. So those fields mostly trucking, oil and gas, construction. You have electricians out in the oil and gas field. You have, all sorts of different industries out there helping out. So that's pretty much our main bread and butter. We can with the Leavitt Group. That's also help. We'll get somebody will call me, well, have you ever insured this type of business before? A hospital or something like that. Well, the great thing about being with Leavitt Group is there's somebody in Leavitt Group that specializes in that. And I can pick up the phone and call that person, and we know exactly how to insure them, and we have an expert right on the end of the line right there. And that's what makes us so special and such a powerhouse. We can help any business or any industry out.
One of the things I've heard and is on our list here to talk about today is your different approach to selling. Of course, everybody's kind of familiar with, I think unfairly so, for all groups, because we, of course, have ad reps here, salespeople here. Salespeople kind of get a bad name, but a lot of times, the ones that are thrown commonly out are used cars, insurance salesmen. Mm-hmm. Office machinery salesmen like copier, stuff like that is known as being the slick ones and stuff like that. What sets apart the Leavitt Group and you guys personally, your sales approach compared to what people might expect?
Yeah, so the traditional insurance sales setup is the quote and hope, what we call it, right? so you walk into a business 2 or 3 months before they renew and you say, hey, let me quote you, right? I can hopefully save you some money. So then you say, and of course everybody in the insurance industry does this at some point. So you say, okay, well, let me quote you. Well, then, you get your quote back. Well, it's not cheaper. Okay, well, maybe better luck next year, Well, our approach, we try to be more professional and more consultative side of things. So really what we want to do is doesn't matter the time of year, doesn't matter when you're new. We're not even going to come in and quote you. We're going to come in, we're going to sit down, we're going to learn about your business. We're going to teach you about your risk, the things you have. We're going to go through all the contracts you have, every risk that you can find. We're going to teach you guys what you have and what you could possibly need. And then if we end up doing business with you, great. If not, we part ways. And so it just makes it much more of a less a sales approach and more of a helping approach, which, when I got in this industry, it's tough to get into sales when you've never sold anything because you feel seedy. I don't know if you agree with that a little bit, but, in this way, it helps me sleep at night because I know I'm trying to help businesses and not just sell them something, a piece of paper.
And I think one of the cool tools, this is Rulin again, and one of the cool tools that we do have is we get to go in and, we were with a business last week and, they're like, we have no idea what we have no idea what's covered, there's just so many things we don't know. And so we can sit down and actually walk you through line by line. This is the coverage you have. This is the coverage where maybe you have a gap that, you're not expecting, any more cyber, hazmat, stuff like that. Those are risks that a lot of people don't even think about. And, just give me a policy and just give me the best pricing on that policy. It's not about just, giving them a savings from what they were paying before. It's about saying, hey, this is where you're at and this is where you may have some exposure. Let us come in there and address those. And if we can get you a better price, great. But if we can give you the correct coverage, because a lot of people don't understand, the state minimums on insurance, it's 25, 50, 25. Well, each state has different minimums, and you have 25,000 per occupant of that vehicle for medical. You have 50,000 for all occupants. Well, how many times, do people get in accidents and it's well over $100, $200, $300,000, and then 50,000 or $25,000 coverage for somebody's vehicle? You may be way underinsured, and so one of the things we do, like my coverage alone, I'm at 100, 300, 100, 100,000, for medical for one person, up to 300,000 for the occupants, and then ultimately, at the end of the day, the vehicle that you were in an accident with, they'll cover these trucks nowadays. If you only have state minimums of 25,000, you get in an accident with a $100,000 vehicle. Guess what? You have to come up with the difference. And so, getting somebody to understand those numbers and say, "Wow, I didn't think of it that way." Let us address it, and let's make sure I have the correct coverage and make sure that you don't have an exposure, because it's all about taking a risk. How much are you willing to defer that risk? And becoming an agent, you help people understand where they're at, where they stand, and ultimately, hopefully, our job not to just sell, but is to educate and help somebody prepare for something that they hope they won't use, but if they don't want, if they don't have it, you'll want to. It's like life insurance. People don't want to buy life insurance. Well, when something tragic happens, you wish you had it at that point.
Well, let's educate me some here, and hopefully some of the listeners as well, because you brought up auto insurance, for example, and you brought up medical with auto insurance, 2550. A lot of people think to decline that kind of coverage or whatnot because, we all have health insurance. Where does one kick in? Why have both?
Well, I had a friend, and her daughter was moving to Arizona, and her boyfriend was in front of her, and this happened 2 weeks ago, and the boyfriend turned and pulled out right in front of her, and he dropped his dropped his auto insurance 2 weeks before their trip. Well, she had a liability only, so it didn't cover hers. It covers the vehicle that she hit. So having just liability only is an exposure, but then him not having insurance. So at the end of the day, he lost his vehicle because he didn't have insurance. She lost her vehicle because she didn't have full coverage, and so both of them are now without vehicles. They have to make buy a new vehicle. Plus, if he, comes out and pays her back for the vehicle, he doesn't have to unless she goes in and, goes to court, that type of stuff. And, having the correct coverage, it leaves a responsibility on insurance companies. I know a lot of people just pay their premium, hey, here's my check each, year, I'll never use it. Well, when that, bad thing does happen, that black cloud comes over your head and you get in an accident, something you didn't prepare for, guess what? It could save your bacon and, give you medical coverage, for an accident. And, one of the things we're having now is a lot of people think, oh, if I get in an accident with a semi or something, it's a big payday, and anymore it is. And, prices are going up across the board because you have these huge nuclear settlements where people are getting millions and millions of dollars for an accident that wasn't their fault. But, what point do we have to be responsible? I know in Utah they had a big settlement of over $50 million for a pedestrian auto accident, and it's one of those things where you have to be reasonable and just make good decisions. And that's one of the things that we want to provide, is that knowledge so people can make best decisions on their behavior. Because the last thing you want to do is go in and be underinsured and you have an exposure of having a business or have personal wealth, and at the end of the day they come out and say, well, you didn't have the correct coverage, so we're going to come in and sue you and take your retirement and put you in the poorhouse. And before you know it, your whole life changed because of texting and driving. Something like that happens, and people just don't think of the long-term aspects. And we just try to help people prepare for a bad situation that maybe hopefully never comes, but sometimes it does.
You talked about going into companies and assessing their risk and things of that nature. Talk a little bit about how somebody in the oil, gas, or trucking or whatnot gets their MSA, gets their COI, Master Service Agreement, Certificate of Insurance, but also some of the other contracts that can affect their coverage or affect their rates.
Yeah. So any, you have, when you're in business, you're going to have lease agreements. You're going to have subcontractor agreements. You're going to have, all these, basically anything you have an agreement. Like, we're working with the golf course over in Douglas. They have agreements with the city. They have agreements with the pro. They have agreements with the restaurant inside and everything like that. All those can affect, if there is a claim, it could come back to the original business if you have a contract with them. Mm-hmm. So those contracts are very important to review to make sure you have hold harmless language in there, things like that. And that's something we always review when we come into these companies that a lot of other companies, like I said, you come in and you just quote them. You don't know what kind of agreements they have. You don't know what contracts are in place. We can review them. We can help you get those contracts in place to better help your business, to get the wording switched around. That's where our risk management can also help out. We can look at your loss history. We can look at your EMOD scores, which is basically your workers' comp. If you have a lot of accident, a lot of claims from the people that work in your industry or for your company, we can come in and look at that and say, well, why is that? And we can bring in our risk management team and we can help out make a plan to change that and that would also lowers your premiums. And at the end of the day, everything we do is about, taking care of the company risk, but also this all helps out in lowering your premiums, because then we can market it to the carriers and say, look at everything we're doing to make this company better, to make it safer, to get these contracts in place where the company's not going to get sued. And that in turn helps the carriers lower your premiums. So at the end of the day, it is always about that. But
and that makes sense to us. Of course, not only here on the radio, but we own the 3 newspapers here in town, and I've been that side of the business since 1999. So I go all the way back to when there were still kids delivering the newspaper, and they were all 1099 contracts, had the hold harmless. It just got so weird of a fishy world that we just said, regardless of the contract or not, it's just not worth it anymore. So we still do have one here, 2 here in Lander. One's an adult great dude, and we have 1 kid, I do believe, left, but we've been phasing those out over time just because it's Lander and Riverton aren't exactly bikeable cities, so to speak, as far as now, especially crossing Federal or crossing Main Street, Lander or whatnot. Yeah. So we're familiar with that part of it, but there was a whole cottage industry built around insuring carriers, still is, even for the driver ones. There's a couple of companies that really focus on that, so it's always interesting to hear from another perspective. You spoke about the risk management. Of course, the other part of the insurance game, that whether it's a big-time company, small company, or little individual or big family, doesn't really matter. What they want to know is when they need you guys, what is the claim support like? Because I think everybody kind of has a vision, and it's every stereotype, I guess, is based in some reality somewhere. Someone got it started, but that they're just going to be on hold all the time when they're at the hospital with their employee, or they're, dealing with a catastrophic loss of equipment because somebody just ran amok, came in, vandalized at a high level. What is your claim support like?
Well, what we have here at the Leavitt Group is we actually have an in-house, risk management. David Mulberry, him and his wife Stacy, she's our claims advocate, where she'll follow through and she'll follow the claim from the start, and then check up twice a week, every week, making sure that claim is being processed. Because a lot of times, I need additional paperwork, we need additional information, police reports, whatever it is, and that support in having Dave come in and actually sitting down saying, okay, here's where some of your EMODs or your scores aren't where they need to be. Okay, well, let's look at employee behaviors, employee actions, driving habits, the ability to come in. And I know we're working with a local company here in town, and it's like, hey, we have this risk, we have that risk. Well, did you think of this? Well, we never thought about that. And so you just look at the risk that people go through. And I grew up on a dairy farm, and I had my first stitches at 5 years old, and from many near-death experiences on that farm, I remember being on the tractor sitting on the fender, and my parents never said one time, hey, watch it, if you fall off and fall forward, you're going to get ran over. That was never talked about. And I was 8 years old, I fell out of the back of a pickup truck. When I was 12 years old, I was holding on the side of my brother's step side, and I fell off, and the truck ran over my legs, and I thought, I'm hurt, and I got up and I hobbled up there, and I told my sister about midnight after a junior high wrestling match, I'm like, you ran me over. She's like, get the gate, and her priority was not my risk, but not my injuries. It was doing the things that need to be done. And now doing behavior, maybe it's better, safer, to get inside the cab of the truck instead of riding in the back of the truck, or doing those risky things, and could have ended my life. And it's just those little decisions where you can prepare for that. And that's one of the things we do. We like to come in, like we're going to be speaking in May this year at the Wyoming Truckers Association in Casper, and our risk management team's going to be there. I'm going to talk about my experiences, and people say Rulin Won't Die. They did a documentary a few years ago because of COVID. They had to change the name, but after all the risk and after all the things I've been through, I look at life differently now, being in the insurance industry, because I've seen things happen that affected my life. And if I can help somebody else prepare for a challenge that comes up that they're not prepared for, it maybe change behavior. Like I have one of my clients, trucking company, and it was just a simple, just dropping off a load of old construction, I guess debris, and then he was dropping it off in Casper, and ended up being in a $750,000 lawsuit. And it would have taken 10 seconds to change that behavior. I need to make sure my load's secure. I need to make sure this has happened correctly. And people don't think about that way. And it ended up could cost him thousands and thousands of rate increase because of insurance companies. At the end of the day, they'll end up making that money back, because why? They raise your premiums. They will non-renew you. There's just so many factors that affect insurance overall, and we want to help somebody understand the many different options they have, and ultimately try to change people's behavior through looking at risk.
Okay.
Well, and as far as claim support goes, it's I understand why people get upset with insurance companies, because they are a for-profit business. So our place as a broker is to be the go-between, right? Between the carriers and the customer. So it's in the insurance carrier's best interest to not pay the claim, to drag their feet, to have all their service on that end is going to be lower than taking your money on the front end, right? Mm-hmm. So our claim support is going to be pushing all of that to move along as fast as we can, to get that in line, to get you paid faster, to make sure the claims get wrapped up quicker. Because the longer it drags out, the more money it's going to cost the business, essentially, or the person. We had, a claim where, there was a refrigerated truck that got in the wreck. Well, the adjuster couldn't come out and look at it, so we had to push him out there. And because he didn't get out there in time, the entire meat in the truck got spoiled. And so then they had to pay that out too. And so that's on the company because it wasn't directly affected by the wreck, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's just things like that. You got to push the companies forward to get this whole process done with. And that's where the claims support comes in handy. Stacy tracks all that and makes sure that they keep moving forward, and they're actually getting things done what they're supposed to be doing.
All right, let's talk about the one thing that everybody likes to talk about, because everything seems to be going up. But why are rates increasing? But at the same point in time, what are some actions that can be done by companies or individuals to lower those premiums?
Yeah, so like Rulon said earlier, one of the big pushers, especially for large industries, oil and gas, trucking, are just what we in our industry call nuclear settlements. You know, there's like Rulon said earlier, pedestrian accident. I think that settlement was over $80 million. And I mean, there was another settlement that was over 20-some million dollars. There was a truck parked in a parking area off the side of I-80 with his flashers on. Car runs into the back of him. The company has to pay out $20 million. You know, and so without caps on these settlements, you know, any excess umbrella policies, liability policies, they keep increasing in price because the companies are losing money, especially in autos, because of these large settlements that these companies are having to pay out. And then when you have turnaround and then any contracts with any companies you're going to work with in oil and gas, because of these settlements, they're increasing what your coverage requirements are. You know, 10 million excess policy, 25 million excess policies. And it's because of a lot of this. Now, on the other side of that, we all know prices of everything increasing, right? So the cost of building in Wyoming is extremely high. Mm-hmm. The cost of buying vehicles is extremely expensive. Everything is going up. So the insurance carriers have to also make up for that too. And, you know, a lot of renewals this year, 8 to 9% up. Well, why did it increase 8 to 9%? Well, what do you think the cost of everything increased by over the last year? You know, the carriers are just trying to keep up. And so that's kind of why premiums keep increasing every single year. And it's been a hard market, which we call when insurance premiums increase, basically since COVID in 2020.
Yeah, I think with the overall looking at, you know, how you can implement some of those things, you know, the vehicles you buy, you know, that's one of the formulas, and people look at it, you know, you go in and you quote somebody's home and auto, they actually go in, they look at your driving record, they look at your credit score, and they're going to rate you on that. The one thing about insurance is if you're here in Wyoming, you're paying for people in Florida. And, you know, ultimately, I think in the insurance world, you have a captive, and a captive sells one product. And us being an independent, you know, we don't just have one product. We shop it to the market. We throw it out there and we say who will give us the best rate for the best coverage. And, you know, when we come in and quote somebody, we want to look apples to apples, and we want to compare things. And the end of the day, you know, you may have your price go up, you may have it come back down. And, you know, ultimately the last thing a person wants to do, and I've been with some of those captives before, and I never shopped it around, and it's just too much hassle, too much this. And I had a good friend of mine, he was the former Utah Jazz Bear, the mascot from them. And, you know, we went in and we looked at it, and, you know, I said, okay, well, it's $200 a month, you know, extra, you know, you're paying with the coverage you have. And I said, you've been with that group for, you know, 15 years. So take 200, you know, a month times a year, you know, that's 2,400 times, you know, 15 years. How much is that? That's $30-something thousand. It's only $200 extra a month. Well, guess what? The end of the day, we want to find people the best coverage, the best price, and the best. You know, I think one of the things that the Leavitt Group has, you know, we have 40 people. So if you have a business and they say, hey, we need a certificate of insurance, we have an email. You send it to our LISR is what we call it. You send it there. You know, you send it to the agent, and, you know, you have a problem. You have my cell phone. You know, you have Gordon's cell phone. We have, you know, 4 agents that work out of our office in Casper. You have all of our contacts. You have 40 people of staff in St. George. And one of my, you know, clients in Casper who, you know, came in, he said, you know, I got you in here because, yeah, Rulon, you're a gold medalist, you're this, that, the other, but not just a gold medalist. You know, you are customer service based, you know, your company, everything's been really good. So you know what? Now I'm going to give you referrals because I see, and we know, you know, his secretary, Rhonda, she's like, man, this has been so amazing because I asked for anything within 10, 15 minutes. I have it. You know, some of the other agents, some of the other brokerages, some of the other companies out there in the insurance world, it may be a month, it may be a week, it may be 2 hours. And if you have a truck driver sitting on the side of the road that needs to get a COI, needs to get, you know, some type of document from, you know, the insurance company, and they may sit there a whole night. How much is lost in that? And one of the things about us is we want to see things, you know, 6 months out. You know, I have 2 businesses here in Riverton, and we're going to quote them, 150 days out. Well, do you need that much time? We want to make sure that we can get the best pricing and the best representation for you, and that's why my broker drove up from Vernal, Utah, 2 weeks ago to come here to Riverton to make sure that people know that we will provide the service. Plus, we actually have the knowledge that people are looking for.
All right. Well, guys, I want to thank you guys for joining us. Once again, we've been with the Leavitt Group. It's been with Gordon Sawyer and Rulon Gardner. And, guys, if someone's listening today and it's going, hey, you know what, I need to talk to those guys about my insurance needs, how they get in touch with you?
Well, you can go through, I'm Rulon Gardner. You can go through, RulonGardner.com, Facebook, you can contact us via that way. Well, it's funny, I was just thinking, I was here in 1999, about 6 months before I won the Olympics. Garth Yates, one of the contractors here in town, he brought me in to do a wrestling clinic, and sat down with about 3 weeks ago and had a nice conversation with him for an hour and talked about being here in Riverton and memories, but then also moving forward what we're looking at doing. And Gordon has a number, I have a number. My number is 719-964-7829.
Yeah, I mean, you can call our office number in Casper. It's 307-266-3020. You could also go online. So at www.leavitt.com/Vernal. That'll take you to our homepage, and you can actually set up appointments. You can get our contact information, or you can email Rulon and I. It's just our name, so mine is Gordon-Sawyer@leavitt.com.
And mine is Rulon-Gardner@leavitt.com.
All right. Well, thank you guys, and thank you for tuning in today. Sarah will be back on the show tomorrow, and we'll see you next time here on 101.7 KDNO.